All right, it's officially 12:02 and we've exceeded 100, so I think we might get going. I think that's a good critical mass. Leanne Redden with the RTA, again, welcoming and thanking everyone for joining us for our conversation with Jody Holton from SEPTA. We're going to be specifically talking about the fiscal cliff. Just a couple of small housekeeping items before we get going. Um, we will be recording this, and as we've done with all of our Transportation Tuesdays, we share the recording of this with all the registrants after that and a summary of the sessions so people can have that for their use. And as Jody and I are talking, if you have questions, we will leave time for Q&A at the end. But because we have such a large number of participants in the session today, we're asking that you put your questions into the chat. Staff will be monitoring that and we'll entertain those kind of a little bit later in the discussion. So with that, I think we can quickly get going. And before we jump into the convo with myself and Jody, I've asked Maulik Vaishnav on our team here at RTA just to share a few facts and figures to just kind of orient everybody and give people some context for the conversation. So Maulik, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Leanne. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. This is a very interesting topic, as we can see with all of you here. We will very quickly walk you through a few slides to set some basic information about Chicago and Philly. There are lots of folks here who probably have a pretty good idea of the size of our regions and how we compare. But one of the big reasons to have this conversation is that in some ways, our regions are very identical, not just in the issues we are facing, but the type of land use density and the amount of transit service that is out there. So as you can see on the screen, Philadelphia region is about a few million fewer residents than us, but in terms of density, we are spot on, very similar at the regional level with each other. Chicago is a bigger center for Illinois. Philadelphia and few other cities in Pennsylvania sort of make up a similar portion. And both are economic centers of our state. And transit obviously plays a huge role in getting us around and keeping that GDP high up there. We also serve a similar type of a network in terms of a reach for the proportion of the region that we have. One of the key unique things about Philadelphia compared to Chicago is their ability to have maintained some of the streetcars that Chicago does not have anymore. Very quickly on transit operations and comparisons there. As you know, and for folks in Illinois, the conversation in Springfield is not only revolving around funding, but also governance. And here you'll see some of that conversation come up between Leanne and Jody about how we have similar fiscal issues across the country, even if we have different governance structures, especially with SEPTA being a centralized agency for the whole Philadelphia region. Our recovery from fare revenue is pretty similar. The ridership proportionally for us has exceeded 1 million, and for SEPTA has exceeded 700,000. Similar sort of recovery out of COVID. And relatively similar operating cost per mile. These are efficient systems compared to our peers, and you'll hear a little bit of that. One of the other key things you'll hear a little bit about is some of the conversations around capital versus operating funding that is coming up, especially in the recent conversations happening at SEPTA and in Pennsylvania. But both agencies have vehicles and assets beyond useful life that is a pretty big number, which is what we spend a lot of our capital dollars making sure our assets are, we are able to get more of them in a state of good repair. And as we discussed, the operational fiscal cliff will be the biggest part of this conversation. So just wanted to level set with folks who may not know where the two regions are. And obviously not all information is on this one slide, but the key differences I'll highlight is that our region has spent about 80% of the reserves, primarily through COVID relief funding, and are projected to run out starting next year, versus SEPTA and many other regions reached their fiscal cliff last year or the year before. We have worked on many things since the legislature adjourned with no funding in May of 2025, including more work on efficiencies, directing revenue where we can to deal with the ADA funding issue this year, and delaying CTA's fiscal cliff next year, but just by a few months. And so we are about to walk into our veto session in Springfield in a couple of weeks, which will be critical to figuring out what the future looks like next year for our system. Comparatively, SEPTA received temporary funding out of the road fund in fall of 2024 that delayed some of the cuts and fare increases SEPTA had to propose. They've done a lot of work in efficiencies and other aspects that you'll hear about. And after their state legislature did not additionally fund transit, SEPTA actually had to go through the full process, lay out exact cuts, and actually start implementing some of them just past month. And a temporary solution has come through, but it has come with a little bit of a cost of transfer of capital funds to operations. So it will delay the cliff, but it leads to some other issues that you'll hear about. So that's enough from me. I'll turn over to Leanne to get the conversation going. Thanks everyone again for joining.
Thanks, Malik. Appreciate that sort of context. So Jody, let's just kind of jump in and start some conversation. We touched on this a little bit, but if you can sort of share a little bit more information about sort of SEPTA's efficiency and accountability program within your transformation office, to be precise. You guys put together a ton of information that really shows that efficiencies alone would not stave off the cuts. And I guess more specifically, what was the intended impact of that work, and how do you think that it's sort of impacted your discussions in the current political conversations that you're having right now around funding?
Yeah, so we started the Efficiency and Accountability Program back in 2021. So it's had a nice, robust life for the last 4 years. We've been working on it. And it was intended at the time, like in the height of COVID, understanding that our budget was in duress and that, our fare revenues were down and the COVID relief acts were starting to spin up. And but it was something that we did as a bottom-up approach in all of our divisions and departments to really find ideas from everything from how we inventory our warehouses and parts, how we, whether we should close certain ticket offices and go to all electronic fares. And it was really meant to give every department a sense of empowerment and to be the industry expert in their area and to help them find ways to be as efficient as possible. So we put a tremendous amount of effort into it, and this stuff doesn't happen overnight. So it's very useful in the conversations today, but it was something that, we had to build up that muscle of like asking, questioning our own processes and really finding those savings. And we did find savings. So we'd say about each year we have recurring savings about 40 million a year, and over the life of the project now we've accrued about 90 million in savings. We also, looked at processes and procedures that might not be a cost savings, but they're definitely break down the bureaucracy a little bit of an agency of our size, and I'm sure your size too. So it helps because when we talk to Harrisburg, we can quantify the savings of those initiatives, and we can point out that we have a lot of professional trust and our industry leaders in various areas, whether it's procurement or fare collection or, whatever the case may be. But then so we had accumulated those savings. And when the budget crisis really hit back in 2023 for us, preparing for our fiscal 20 5 budget, we implemented an austerity measures. And that's not to be confused with the efficiency and accountability program. The austerity measures was no raises for management, no travel, any expenses scrutinized, really a hiring freeze in a lot of management areas, and a number of other things like that. And that yielded another 30 million. So we were able to put those two numbers together. Austerity measures are not something that we ever want to continue because it's obviously not sustainable to not give raises, and we have a contract coming up, so that's not a sustainable option. But it does really help. I mean, we were able to show that we are one of the most efficient transit agencies, right there with CTI and your agencies too, but that on average, our costs per trip are below our peers in bus, metro rail, and regional rail or commuter rail systems. So that is really helpful when trying to convince people in the middle of our state in Harrisburg that don't use transit, don't understand its worth, but it's helpful to them to say, yeah, but we're doing it at a lower cost than lots of our peers. So it's a good investment.
No, I appreciate those insights. And I think a key point here, you're ahead of us, right? And that's sort of Moloch summarized that we're sadly catching up to you in terms of the timing of our fiscal cliff. And I can honestly say that we've modeled a lot of the work that we and our 3 operators in our region have been talking about on the work that SEPTA has kind of led the way on. And while you might be in some respects the most efficient, I think we're right on your heels.
You're right there.
But I think it's important, and I'm encouraged that that's sort of been a winning conversation with some of your electeds in your state capital. I'm not sure that we've got as much traction in our region, so I still feel like we've got to just keep pushing that message forward on our end on the savings efficiencies. And I mean, actually, our budgets have been cut since 2014. So, if you start looking at that, and shame on us maybe for not talking about all of them as efficiencies along the way, but we've managed to keep balanced budgets even way pre-COVID with shrinking funds. But moving on, I guess that's one of the things it's unique to us, and it's different from SEPTA. But part of our conversation as we've been facing our sort of fiscal cliff and our financial challenges has been this conversation around, you are one entity that has a multitude, several modes underneath you. We here at the RTA are kind of that umbrella organization, but we have 3 distinct operators that have a certain level of autonomy and a certain level, the way the state statutes are written, that there's certain things dictated by state statute on how we interact and what their roles and responsibilities are. But one of the conversations that's been transpiring in our region is, about consolidating the 3 operators into one agency, or at a bare minimum, creating a much stronger sort of regional oversight entity. And in our legislative session that wrapped up this past May, that the full consolidation didn't end up on the table. But these conversations are still likely to happen and could be happening, starting again up again as soon as, in the coming weeks. But more specifically, as it relates to sort of SEPTA and your structure, could you share some sort of insights from your perspective on how planning actually works within a consolidated agency? And is that structure, that sort of does schedulings for buses, regional rail, commuter rail, etc. Is there some independence between them, and what's the relationship between those very distinct modes too that serves as sort of a diverse geographic region, a diverse population, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I would say first off is that when we started planning for this fiscal cliff and looking at how to reduce service, we didn't have the same issue that you guys have, where CTAs doesn't have enough, has a big fiscal cliff, Pace maybe not, and I'm not sure Metra and so forth, but
somewhere in the middle.
yeah, somewhere in
Yeah.
the middle. So for us, it's all one SEPTA, and so that makes it more fair across the region and almost easier to coalition build, because I can't cut just commuter rail, I can't cut just bus, and I can't cut just metro. So we had to put together this plan it involves all of our counties. We're a 5-county region or service area. And so we had to create this service reduction plan of 20% and then 45%. And we had to do the other thing that is going to be interesting for you is that we do the Title VI analysis, really determining whether or not to make sure that we're not discriminating in our policies. So cutting 20% evenly across minority communities and low-income communities is the same as our cuts or lower than our cuts to non-minority and higher income communities. So, and that became a sticking case. We actually were taken to court over whether or not our service reductions were discriminatory. And of course, I will say there's no finding there because we did do the Title VI analysis and we did cut evenly across the region. But I think that that's something that might be easier because, it was fair and all the people in our counties, all of our constituencies didn't start picking at the service reduction plan. You cut too much from my county, you cut too much from the city or something. So it was all fairly even across the region, and therefore everybody was united in the dislike of the plan. So
Sadly.
if you can go for that's the best we can get at this point, is just have people united behind the need for more funding for transit across the board. And so that is one way in which I think having it all in one house is easier to coalition build. And in general, like our schedulers and our service planners for all of those modes are in one office right outside me. And they coordinate. We use the same scheduling software for bus and metro rail, but we use a different one for our commuter rail. We try to interline or, integrate those systems, have certain meets between the modes. But for the most part, we do that through improving frequency. So people's transfers amongst modes are just, they're within 15 minutes by nature of the schedule rather than trying to make it perfectly aligned. But yeah, it is nice to be in one office and think about things that way. But yeah, I find it probably will come up if you're planning cuts in one specific area or the city versus the suburbs.
Yeah, I think that is a challenge that we have to continue to grapple with, like you noted, or as you know, like CTA is facing a fiscal cliff, and on the other extreme is Pace, our suburban operator, is able to get through all of 26. We get smacked, everyone gets smacked in the face in 27 if we don't find a solution, a funding solution here. I do like the fact, I just want to highlight something that you noted, the key thing is it's not as much about sort of having a schedule, a bus meter train on a specific time frame. It's the key component is the frequency, adding more frequency of service. And that's something we've talked a lot about leading up to the fiscal cliff. It's sort of the two ends of the spectrum, right? This is the dire circumstances if we don't find a funding solution. But if we choose to invest and actually can provide either more service than what we're currently funded to be able to provide, you eliminate that need you overcome that challenge of connectivity and schedule coordination, because even if you just miss a bus, for example, there's another one coming 7, 8, 10 minutes behind, and so it's not a critical time frame. You're not sitting there for half an hour, 45 minutes. And so I think that's a key point that is part of our ideas around how, if we're investing in the system, that frequency of service is what really starts to be a game changer. But I digress off the actual fiscal cliff that we're meant to be focusing on here. Sorry about that. So, and Malik touched on this, but maybe if you can expand a little more. In your first round of emergency funding, your Governor Shapiro, flexed highway funds to transit last year. So, how important was that highway money for you? And though nothing's ever a perfect solution, right? Where do you think sort of SEPTA would have been should that sort of creative or that infusion of money, that temporary infusion of money be? Where do you think you would have been? But then I think as importantly, what's the long-term impacts of this sort of policy change or this one-time flex of funding to transit operations in terms of the broader context of the organization?
Yeah. So last year and we're on a July to July fiscal year. So last year in our budget, we budgeted on what we call hope that there would be a funding solution provided by the legislature in Harrisburg. And that did not happen. And so we had to start talking about, after we had an adopted budget that had a deficit in it, a structural deficit in it, we had to talk about how we were going to reduce service. And so when the governor flexed those federal funds to transit, as he's allowed to do, 153 million came to our operating budget. And so our fiscal 25 budget was made whole. We would have had to cut service by 20%. We would have had to have put about a 21.5% fare increase into place to try to cover that budget gap. And it probably would have gotten a little close. I mean, because at that point we would have only had 6 months left in the budget. So we'd only have had 6 months of time to accrue that additional revenue and to accrue the savings from not running the service. So it was absolutely critical. PennDOT, so his administration, provided the list of projects that were going to have money taken out of it. When he flexed the dollars, it had to be in that current fiscal year. So PennDOT projects, our DOT's projects, had to show which projects had, maybe weren't meeting their milestones and weren't going to spend the money. And so they found projects, I think it was 6 or 7 across the entire state, that they would take that money from. And they had to show that it wouldn't delay those projects. So they did that. And I would say that politically, the backlash from that, while it's absolutely essential for us to run that year, it did create problems. Some in the legislature did not believe that projects weren't being delayed. So they thought that this transfer of funds would delay highway projects in areas where they're needed. And our highway friends also do have a problem with funding themselves. So, with gas tax revenues falling, and they also are not in a great situation either, funding wise. So I would say politically, it was a divisive move. Absolutely necessary, absolutely within, the ability of the governor and in the federal regulations allowed to be done. But it was a divisive move, and it was politically used against us further on down the road. So it's break glass when absolutely needed.
Well, it's sort of the two-edged sword nature of it, right? So it allowed you to sort of stave off the cuts and the fare increase temporarily, but it sort of created more challenges into some of your long-term sort of financial slash political conversations. And I think these will be some of the very same kinds of questions that we in our region and our state are going to have to grapple with. We already are eligible. Just on the state side, we're eligible. We actually received some monies already from the road fund, if you will. And so it's not unprecedented that monies do flow to us. But yeah, they, as you noted, they can be options that the governor slash the DOT can make decisions to do temporarily or even permanently if they chose to.
Yeah.
especially in the
Even
conversation. Sorry, go ahead.
I should mention that in a prior fiscal crisis that we had back in 2007, our governor at the time did a similar thing. And if you can believe it, those that people brought that up again, that, oh, you're taking from highways again. But we do flex money as a standard course of operation for our congestion mitigation air quality funds, that are FHW funds. We do flex some of them to transit on a regular basis. But the difference is that this is like an emergency move and you have to take it from that fiscal year budget.
Yeah.
So that's what became a little divisive, I'll say.
So that kind of segues into my next question, sort of a follow-up. And people, if they're following these issues around our region, and if they're reading even a lot of stuff, because we've been trying to push out like SEPTA as a sort of a harbinger of things to come if we don't find a solution, if you will. But you most recently were also forced to flex federal capital dollars to operations to further stave off cuts, right? You'd sort of hit the cliff. There was no funding solution in Harrisburg. You were instigating the service cuts and fare increases, court intervention, and sort of given different direction. Talk a little bit about that for us, if you can, and sort of are you doing internally to sort of figure out, sort of even just internally, not just the political side and the broader conversation, but the internal side on sort of the sacrifices, if you will, that you're going to have to be making in terms of slowing down, pushing back capital, because as you already noted, like all transit agencies, we're not just underfunded on the operating side. There's a strong need for funding on the capital side, especially in big old legacy systems like we both sort of that we both have. So talk a little bit about that from the internal perspective with SEPTA and your sort of capital program.
Yeah, so our capital program has been underfunded for decades, and we can, we we get about half of what we would say our peers get in terms of capital funding on a regular basis. And so in the past year, when we adopted our fiscal 26 budget for operating, we also adopted our capital budget. And that capital budget, we had to defer about 1.6 billion in capital projects over the 12-year program. 44 projects were deferred because of the rise in construction costs, inflation in general, just the cost of these projects going up. And then, certain types of projects in our industry have just skyrocketed, whether it's a new signal system, just have doubled in price. So we had to already defer or descope 44 projects in the capital budget. So we are walking back promises on making all of our stations ADA on our subway elevated system. In the next 12 years, we had thought that we would have a completely accessible system. So that had to be walked back. Our trolley modernization program, where we replace all of our trolleys with low floor vehicles that are ADA compliant, that again is being pushed out. We're still moving ahead with it, but it's descoping pieces of it and pushing out pieces of it. So there are very important projects that have already been sacrificed. And so this means we'll have to find 394 million more to pull out, to defer from that 12-year program. And we were given authorization from the state to use our capital funds for operating. So when they gave us that ability, they said you can do that, but you can't affect any safety critical projects, which is difficult. Every project we do has a component of safety. So we really have to prioritize and figure out which ones are absolutely critical. And then none of our rail vehicle replacement projects could be taken out, which we have one of the oldest fleets, rail fleets there is. We have over 50-year-old regional rail cars make up 2/3 of our fleet. So the state made us keep all of those projects and still find something to cut. And we are working on it right now. There's a capital planning committee to try to figure out what we can defer. It's not going to be easy.
I'm going to jump around in some of the questions I was thinking of asking you just to sort of build off what you just said. But both of our systems are big, as we've noted, legacy systems. They're old, they're large, and all of our stated good repair needs are pretty high, and as we've already both noted, underfunded. Um, the capital budgets, the numbers when people see them, in the billions, look very high and looks like it's a lot of money. What are you talking about? You don't have enough money, kind of thing. So, on the surface, it looks like you could take some money out, a few million here, 100 million there, and it, may not have much of an impact. But like realistically, how long, from your perspective, can you keep doing this and sort of, I'm sure the answer is never, for no, not at all. But I mean, talk a little bit about sort of how that looks in terms of that long-term outlook for the system.
Yeah. Financially, what that looks like is, 5 to 10 years from now, most of our capital program is paying debt service. So we're just borrowing more, essentially. So as a result, we have a lot less capacity to put projects in the capital program in future years. I mean, we have, a, a, a great vision for how our service could be improved, whether it's the frequency of the bus service, where we have a new bus network plan that really focuses service where there's demand and more frequent routes. We have, to modernize our fleets, our rail fleets on the L and the B lines are old and operationally they're not reliable, or they're becoming less reliable. So
Yeah.
we're not able to improve service on those lines either, without new fleet. And the same with our regional rail service. A lot of our dwell time and the efficiency of scheduling that system doesn't allow us to improve service. I mean, we also have to hire more crews and more engineers and so forth. But one of the issues that we have is that our infrastructure is really not set up to be as efficient as possible to take advantage of the capacity of the rail network. So, having level boarding would improve our ability to provide more service on regional rail. With our current fleet, that's not happening. And so there's a lot that we can do, but it requires that continual investment in the fleets and in the infrastructure, the track and the catenary, the signal systems. And all of those things have been hit especially hard in the last few years, whether it's because of manufacturing or supply chain or, whatever it is, it costs, a lot more than it used to.
Yeah, I think we all have pretty significant what we call state of good repair needs or backlogs, because of the underfunding even on the capital side, and these sort of one-time or short-term sort of infusions might kind of get us through a period. But I mean, ultimately, like you said, they're not sustainable, right? It leads to not just delaying projects, but further deterioration of the network and the systems and the infrastructure you have, which leads to more deferred maintenance, which leads to more breakdowns, more service disruptions, higher longer term costs too, as we look out to the future and sort of, it just becomes a compounding effect that is super challenging for us to sort of, as my mother would say, robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're sort of you might dig yourself out of one little hole over here or sort of keep your head above water a little bit, but you've created a bigger problem for the future on that other side. And so it's just, none of these are good choices that anyone's being forced to make in all of these conversations. So trying to sort of maybe go a little more positive here, but we're about 1 year out from a a federal surface transportation bill. That's the federal program or the federal funding package that really helps us look out about 5 years and sort of gives us a sense of sort of what those revenues, those dollars might be to infuse into our transit networks. This current administration has indicated, that funding could be reduced from previous years. As I don't even want to mention that we're also facing right in the very immediate term, a potential government shutdown. But and I think the challenge in reduced funding is sort of could be even more threatening to major urban areas, where, there've been threats of cutting funding completely kind of thing. But talk a little bit about what you're thinking about the future of federal investments, sort of as we look to as we are collectively nationally working on sort of federal reauthorization, because we have to kind of keep all these things running on parallel tracks, literally.
Yeah, I think we're submitting comments to the open request for information. I think that's what it was, or to talk about what we think should be a priority of the reauthorization. And we did really well with the rail
Yeah.
vehicle replacement grant program that helped us fund a portion of our replacement for our L cars. So couple $100 million there in grant funding, and we have other fleets we need to replace. So really hopeful that that program can continue to help support the reinvestment in the fleets, a modern fleet. The other thing that we'd love to see is a sort of an opening up of that capital investment grant program, the SIG program, very focused on extensions in the past, and now with the core capacity program, which you guys I think have done well with, looking at ways that can be a little bit more about investment in our rail transit infrastructure. I talked about the signal systems, modernizing them to allow us to get more frequency, how expensive that is, but necessary. And, when I think about how much light has been shown on the issue with air traffic controllers and how they're using antiquated systems, in their processes. I think it's kind of similar in railroad and rail transit, is that, our signal systems are safe and secure, but they are not optimized. So if there's a way that we could, reinforce those programs within reauthorization that help us invest in our rail transit networks, state of good repair, modernization, modern fleets, safer fleets, I think that's where our interests are. We are also very supportive of the ASAP program for accessibility for all stations, and have done well in that program, and would love to be able to add back in some of those projects that we had to take out of our capital program due to the lack of funding from the state and inflation and so forth. So those are two positive areas. And I think we have a unique situation here in Philadelphia with SEPTA and Amtrak, where we essentially lease the tracks from Amtrak for about half of our railroad system, or a third of it. And the payments are fairly high for wear and tear on the system that they need to invest. So if there was any relief we could get there, that we're also looking for that. But that real focus on just making sure that we have funds and programs aligned so that we can reinvest in our rail transit systems would be helpful.
Yeah, I love how you noted it in terms of an investment into the infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure exists, and if we want faster, more reliable, more efficient services, we need to make those investments. And some of that's investment in tech and infrastructure. And these are words that I've heard a lot from the current administration, and recently just spent some time talking to, the new FTA administrator, Mark Molinaro. And I think, us also as an industry, telling the story better about how these are investments. They produce a good return on that investment, not just to the transit system and its operations, but to the sort of trickle down into the economy, both on the supply chain side as well as jobs and access for people and the broader economic engine of our regions. I think it's really important. And I think some other couple of key areas that we've been talking about here, and I know APTA, our national association, is sort of focusing on these things. Are there areas that we can improve in terms of the regulatory space, in terms of project delivery? Because we've got these big backlogs of projects. It's one thing to even have the funding, but can we deliver them quickly and efficiently as possible? And I think that that's an opportunity area with this administration that I'm hoping we can make some progress on as well. So looking forward to those. Conversations. I have the pleasure, the honor, and maybe the challenge of also being very involved at the national level with our association right now for this next year. So reauthorization is front and center, and wearing sort of balancing out what our regions and legacy system needs are with what the transit systems of the entire country need. So I think it's a great conversation for all of us, and challenging conversation that all of us have to have in the coming months. So, appreciate that. We did sort of trying to get us out of the doomsday and sort of a little more to the positives here. If you wouldn't mind, sort of sharing some of your thoughts and perspectives on, where SEPTA could be in terms of that strong and consistent investment. Maybe some of the thoughts, projects, ideas that you're excited about. I know that you guys you've got this really good version of regional rail, and it's something in our region we are aspiring to. Metra, our commuter rail, is taking, what do they say? Copying is the sincerest form of flattery, and they're emulating a lot of what SEPTA has done, and we want to take that to the next level in our region. And I think you really are leaders in sort of that regional rail vision. And just connected to that, where in our region have talked about not just a doomsday and falling off the cliff, but what we would get if we were investing 1.5 billion, which is what not just us, but actually several our MPO for our region has already ordained. Sort of that $1.5 billion investment on an annual basis is kind of the core number that we should be striving to get to really deliver faster, frequent, more reliable service across our region. So that was my setup. What kind of thoughts and ideas? Maybe talk to us a little bit about your regional rail and other initiatives that you might have going, looking forward to with funding at SEPTA going forward.
Well, I would say in the last 5 years, we've spent a lot of time talking to our customers, and they, talking about, how travel patterns are changing, commute times are changing, and talking with them about what is the hindrance of using transit and what would drive you to transit. And over again, people say, we love taking transit. We want it to be more frequent. And I have flexible work hours. I want to go at different times. We've done a lot of work to understand what our customers really want. And now it's, how do we deliver that with this aging infrastructure? And so we came up with, we have a master planning effort that's still underway with reimagining regional rail, and like, how do you deliver more frequency on this kind of antiquated system that we're on, but a good system nonetheless. And we already have pretty good regional rail service. Pre-COVID, we haven't brought back all that service. We're running about 80% of pre-COVID service. And when do we bring back that full service, and what parts of the day do we put it in? So that's what we've been trying to figure out is, if we can get back to 100% of service levels, would we spread it out more evenly across the day? We would capture more riders. We would be useful to more types of trips, whether you're just going to dinner with a friend, or we have good service hours throughout the entire service day. So looking to get to half-hour service in the midday and the off peaks, looking to get on the weekends back to hourly, and in some cases half-hour service on the weekends. There's really a market for it, and we've done some work with some cell phone data by a provider called Replica, and with Deutsche Bahn, a consultant, on looking at really what is the full market of trips in our regional rail network. So people who are in cars or biking or whatever, all the trips along our regional rail network, how many of them are we capturing? So we only capture anywhere from 3 to 6%. We have one line that captures about 12% of all trips in the corridor, but that's unusual. So when are these trips occurring? How can we better design service to fit it? And then in the long run, getting to 15-minute service on our regional rail, really having something that mimics metro rail level of, just show up and go kind of scheduling. So you don't have to be tied to a schedule and planning everything around it. So that's our vision for regional rail, is really to maximize the system and make it run more like a metro rail system. But that, when we look at how much budget we have and all the infrastructure work that needs to be done, in addition to the replacement of 2/3 of the fleet, it is a long-term vision, but we can progress on it along the way. And the same with our bus network, looking at how we can become more frequent. And I think you guys went through a similar process to get a more frequent bus network established. And now it's just a matter of actually making the changes to
implementing the changes. Both on our bus side, both CTA and PACE sort of re-envision their sort of future networks. CTA has actually started delivering on some more frequent service in some key corridors. The challenge, I think, and it's very similar to what you've experienced, is, coming out of COVID, the continued recovery and a certain level of momentum that we feel like we've had and have. And you don't want to sort of walk away from that and sort of turn back on sort of that growth in ridership, that sustaining growth in ridership, that investment in capital, all of these things. It's sort of just, we're going to spend a lot of time and effort really trying to respond and deliver, and then we, facing these, it's, really challenging timing and very frustrating. You mentioned sort of talking to customers and how that sort of translated into some of your sort of re-envisioning the network. We just did a really regionally significant customer satisfaction survey across our entire region, across all of our 3 operators. And noted that some of the feedback we got, that cleanliness and public safety are top of mind for our riders in terms of what needs improvement. And it's not as much about sort of the violent crime that sometimes some of the big headlines kind of tend to grasp onto, more about sort of the broader sense of cleanliness and just feeling safe on the transit system. What are you guys hearing in some of your conversations around, as you're talking to customers as it relates to your transit services?
Yeah, I think, we've kind of turned a corner, I'd say. It has been a rough few years, dealing with cleanliness issues, whether it was the pandemic when we had to wash everything down for, viruses and whatnot. But, we spent a lot of time and investment in safety. So making real changes by hiring additional transit police. I believe about, grown our police force by about 20%, 25% over the last couple of years. We've hired 100 new cleaners on our system, so just station cleaning and vehicle cleaning. We made a real investment over the pandemic years and have continued that investment. And even in the face of our operating budget crisis, it was very clear that we could not compromise on that. And that it was making a difference, that our police, the crime on the system is down, and it's down in Philadelphia as a whole too. So this is part of this recalibration of what is acceptable in a city, um, but I think that we've been a major part of that in enforcing against fare evasion, enforcing against smoking in our transit stations. I assume you guys probably had a similar issue, is that something happened in the pandemic and people forgot you weren't supposed to smoke in public places, and so now we are making a dent in that through public service announcements, through enforcement of it. We've done a number of things to really listen to customers, because very initially in like 2022, 2023, even in 2024, the amount of complaints about the vulnerable population on the system, the smoking, the smells, the cleanliness, was really something that we needed to address. And we've seen the benefit of that. We have things like pit crews at the ends of lines, and deep cleans that are happening much more routinely than they used to. So we don't want to let up on any of that. I think that is now our new standard operating procedure. But it's made a difference. And as a result, our last customer satisfaction survey, we do them quarterly, showed is the highest it's ever been. Now, keep in mind, that's like 3.5 out of 5 stars. So, but for us, it's the highest it's ever been, and people are commenting, and people are not commenting on those that were weighing us down before. So it's very good news, and I think that it's in great part due to all the investments that we've made in that type of maintenance and that type of facility cleaning and fare enforcement and police.
Yeah, I think we do a big, every several years, a big region-wide massive survey, very in-depth, and then we do quarterly panel surveys as well on customer satisfaction. And I can note very similar kind of feedback that we've been getting, certainly improvements from a customer satisfaction standpoint. But I think your point about not letting up on this. I think we have to continue to be vigilant and stay on top of these things, because a lot of it is public nuisance that kind of ends up sort of creating a less inviting environment for riders, and we want to be mindful of that as we continue to want to build back more service, provide safe, frequent, and flexible rides for people across our region. I think it's, yeah. So
just wanted to add to that like in the context of the funding crisis, not only we've not let up on it, but our legislators, it took away one of the things that would be said negatively about us. So, it was before we were doing these things, the news, people would only see what they saw in the news about our system. And by really getting out there and showing those stories, the good stories about all the cleaning that was happening, it took away one of those things. Why should I invest in SEPTA? It's dirty, it's unsafe, and we were really able to come back swinging and say, no, actually, it's not unsafe. It's not dirty anymore. I mean, yes, you have those instances, and we find them frustrating too when you clean a car and then somebody dumps a can of soda all over, but like you're much better prepared to make those arguments with the legislature, and I know you guys are able to do that as well.
Yeah, I think I think we all need to actually continue to do that, and a better job of even telling our own story about it's not just telling it the story, but showing the activities that people are undertaking. I know early on in the pandemic too, SEPTA was kind of a little ahead of the game in terms of sort of dealing with sort of taking a multifaceted sort of intervention type approach on both on the unhoused population as well as dealing with mental illness. And I know we here in our region were watching some of that closely. I know CTA's done some piloting of some of those kinds of multifaceted intervention kind of programs. And again, it comes down to we would love to do more. We again just need more funding to
Yeah.
sort of support those expansions of those kinds of initiatives beyond just the cleaning and the traditional announcements and cracking down on fare evasion and sort of smoking and other things like that. So I think that these are all good progress is being made. Again, back to the point I think I was raising earlier that I know my team hates it because I think I harp on it, is like, we can't lose, and I make this any public forum I can. We don't want to lose the momentum that we've got in terms of making improvements and changes and delivering on what I think is ultimately expected by both the riders and the taxpayers of our region. I think it's something that we need to continue to work on. So, appreciate, and I guess happy that there's a bit of solidarity there in terms of, you guys have been doing some things and it's working and continue to work. And so gives us, I think, the continued push to keep that momentum going as well. I think we're going to wrap up about 1 o'clock, and not wrap up, but allow some Q&A because I know there's a whole bunch going into the chat. And so my team will jump in with that in a minute. But I guess one final kind of closing kind of question for you is, as we're dealing in these political worlds, champions are important, right? Sometimes us telling our own story, I find sometimes seems a bit self-serving. And I think sometimes having other people speak to the role, the value, the benefits of, what the challenges are around a funding crisis and what, opportunities could be ahead of us. How were you able to sort of cultivate champions in your region? How do you work with advocates? What does that landscape kind of look like for you in your region? And who have been some of your best champions as you've been talking with your state capital, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, for us, it's our job as the agency is to provide the information and to get that to the right people. So I think one of the things we've learned through this, and I think we did really well, is to create information that speaks to everyone. So we create an economic impact analysis that described what would happen to our economy if we cut transit in the way that we're talking about. When very clear report, and give that to all of our advocates. And then the same thing with the air quality impacts. We had our MPO run the travel demand model and show how congestion would go across the city and into our suburban communities without the transit service that we have. So getting that right information, that's like the rock bed of the campaign, if you would. And being a public agency, we walk a fine line. We give a lot of information. We try to be as straightforward, as factual as possible. We're not out here to create alarms or whatever, but to do our job and tell people what's happening with our system. So we do have a couple of great advocacy groups. Transit Forward Philadelphia grew out of our bicycle coalition of all things. And they have done a great job in including a number of different, citizens, interest groups, like the disabled community has representation in Transit Forward Philly and Transit Forward Pennsylvania. They also have seniors, a number of different types of advocates. Students are involved as well. So if given that information, I think it's very easy for them to, tell the story and to work with our legislatures to advocate for public transit. So they held rallies. Our Southeast delegation of legislators, so all the legislators in the Philadelphia region, the 5-county region, we had regular briefings with them. Jump on a Teams call. Sometimes it's more staff than legislators, obviously, but just being as straightforward as possible. Here's the reports that we've produced. Here's all the service cuts, and go through it with them. So just giving everybody the same information, but doing it all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes it's over and over again because you'll get a call like, hey, do you have anything on this? Like, yeah, we gave that to you, but we're happy to give it again. And I get it. Like, we're
Exactly.
mired in this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So we kind of eat, sleep, and drink it.
Yeah.
Sometimes don't sleep, from my perspective at least. But I think, yeah, it is our job to keep just reinforcing, providing all the data, being kind of that data source, if you will. Like if you may not, in trying not to take sort of positions and sides, like these are the facts straight up as we see them.
Yeah.
And I think one thing, like I've noted a couple of times here, you guys are kind of further down the path than us. And I know, one of the things that I think in terms of data, there's a lot of conversation in our region now about, so what's the details on potential cuts and things like that, noted, I've noted that when you guys came out with that level of sort of route by route, real schedule kind of detail, it was about, 2 to 3 months ahead of when you were actually going to have to execute upon them. And I
Mhm.
think, we're not quite there yet. But again, as I sort of said, sadly, we're watching closely what you guys are doing and sort of modeling a lot of our sort of responses and behaviors. Obviously, we know what we're required, both regionally and federally required to do in these circumstances. But, I think we've watched you guys go through it and learning from that as we kind of continue not just our development of research data and information, but also the sort of the timing of rolling out the specificity on, cuts. I mean, right now we've spent a lot of time talking about it sort of from a regional standpoint and these broader impacts, both economic as well as sort of service. And we will eventually, short of a funding solution, a couple of months out. And right now, looks like CTA is going to probably hit the cliff in that sort of mid-year 26 timeframe. So sometime spring next year is when we'd get to that level of specificity because that's going to be determined based on a lot more detailed analysis, like you mentioned, Title VI analysis and all these sort of prescribed steps that have to happen. And plus, you don't want to, I think, kind of hinting at this, you don't want to sort of put information out there that's, and, these cause a lot of grief and challenge and uncertainty in our communities. I mean, ultimately, the transit system is here to provide service to people and there to support their daily lives. And I think we want to be also very thoughtful and careful about the level of detail and making sure it's right and that it's timed appropriately based on when impacts are going to be, felt across our communities. And so I think that's a good note for us to sort of take from you guys as well. Um, that's kind of my questions. But I think, and I might ask Jessica to come back and I have not been keeping track of chat.
I have.
So Jessica, if you want to sort of throw some questions out to Jody.
Absolutely. We've got, it looks like around 10 questions, so hopefully we can get through them all, but we will do our best. The first is, given New York City's recent success with allocating money to transit through congestion pricing, are any cities considering implementing a similar program as a way to fund transit? And would that produce enough money to address your fiscal cliff?
And you're talking to Jody?
I
I'll
think
let Jody
both.
answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I can start on our perspective, and if you guys have had any perspective, let me know. We are not looking actively at congestion pricing, but I will say the state has spent a lot of time, and transit agencies have spent a lot of time looking at possible funding sources for rectifying the fiscal cliff and the capital budget crisis. So other things we've looked at, we're largely funded on the operating side from the state through our sales tax revenue. We get about 4.4% of all sales tax revenue in the state comes to transit, not just SEPTA, but all transit agencies across the state. We've talked about just increasing that to 6.4%, and that would alleviate our budget crisis on the operating side. That's what received pushback. I know that there are other options available, like rental car fees was one that we looked at. There's delivery fees had some traction, but these options were not just looked at for transit only. So now we start to compete against ourselves for what we want in terms of our transportation modes, like highways funding, road funding was considering the delivery fee in addition to aviation. So there's a lot of transportation needs out there. On the capital side, we've been looking for more local funding, so being able to raise, like, maybe it's a real estate transfer tax of our adjacent counties, our 5 counties. They also looked at a car lease payments or fees. There's been a number of ideas floated for the capital budget crisis, but for the most part, the operating budget had looked at that sales tax revenue. We had looked at one point back in 2007 at tolling one of our interstates, and the federal government would not give us approval to do that. So we only have a couple toll roads in Pennsylvania. That was one thing we considered, and presumably if they wouldn't let us toll some of the interstates, we might not have an easy road to congestion pricing.
Yeah, I will. I mean, similar conversations I think are happening in our region too, in our state. Obviously, sales tax is the primary operating funding source from our region to support the transit system. I think everybody knows that there was a collection of different revenue ideas floated in the last spring session, including delivery fee, real estate transfer tax. The city of Chicago already has a real estate transfer tax that was levied back in 2008, and that money actually now comes already directly to CTA to support transit operations. So the conversation was around expanding it across the rest of the region to support Metra and Pace. But I will say, in terms of the congestion pricing, our region, I mean, well, I'll go back, like New York took about 10 years or more than a decade, I think, of actually doing very detailed analysis on how to execute it in Manhattan. And it's a unique geography, I think, as people understand. It's an island, you've got bridges and tunnels coming in. There's a nice, easy gate, if you will. We don't necessarily have the same kind of geography structure necessarily as easily in our region. And the state and the region has looked in the past at sort of congestion pricing kind of concepts. And I think it's an interesting concept from a sort of a public policy standpoint and from a changing behavior maybe perspective. I'm not sure in our region that it would necessarily it's certainly not going to generate enough money to probably close the gap and generate enough revenue for what we need. I think one thing the RTA has said long since we did our strategic plan several years ago for the region, that we put together a series of sort of funding options that could be considered. And we've not necessarily taken a position on any single one, largely because, to sort of be blunt, all money's green. And that becomes a lot of a political conversation, balancing sort of the competing issues. Let's the elected officials who actually have to take that sort of hard vote decide what's the most viable for our region. So I think we continue, to a point Jody was making just a little bit ago, continue to be a resource in terms of what we think that would generate, what its nexus to transportation is. Does it make sense? Is it regressive, not regressive, those kinds of things. But we're sort of, again, I'll just reiterate it again, open to all funding options to kind of, as long as they are sort of predictable and stable, I think is a key thing for us also going forward to look at a way, because we don't want to sort of come up with something that's completely novel and doesn't necessarily generate the revenues, and you start doing massive expectations and then even potentially massive service planning to deliver more service, and those revenues aren't realized, and then you've got a sort of a different set of challenges that you're facing.
Thank you. That answered a couple of questions, actually. Lots of questions about revenue and kind of what the transit agency's role is in, securing specific revenue sources. What is the subsidy per ride for each of the modes in Philadelphia, Jody?
That's like a pop quiz. Let's think about that. Subsidy per mode. I'm not
And
sure.
Jody, if you don't have it handy, if you or your team maybe we can put it in the summary doc that we put out to people, we can answer that. Yeah, that is like a pop quiz, like, oh, I don't know every data point.
And I can think of it.
Call a friend.
I will call a friend in this situation. I can think of a chart that does show it, but I can't remember the actual numbers on it. I mean, we did do a lot of that is very important and all can be found through NTD, the National Transit Database. And we did create charts that showed by mode, like for example, on bus, as I said earlier, on bus and metro rail and commuter rail, how much the cost per rider was. And I can only remember the percentage that we are below the average. So when you look at every bus operator, every transit operator in the country, we take an average of that, or our peer systems primarily, take an average of that, and we're well below the cost per rider, 18% of that average cost per rider on SEPTA. And then we look at it for all the modes. I highly recommend doing that for yourselves and seeing where you stand, because you probably are pretty close to us in terms of how efficient you are.
And we have a dashboard that's available on our website that kind of tracks not just cost per rider, but cost per revenue vehicle hour, which is another way of looking sort of at a efficiency metric. And we track it against both our peers and we look at across the different modes. So sort of the traditional CTA rail side of things, against, and like for CTA, we look at it against MARTA in Atlanta, Boston, New York City, SEPTA, and Washington, D.C. as sort of example peers. On the commuter rail side, we do something similar and we look at Long Island Railroad, Boston as well, New Jersey Transit, and SEPTA as well, looking at sort of those different kind of. So all of that, if anyone wants to see that from our perspective, and I think, Jody, your point, we can probably summarize and put a link into the broader NTD, but by way of our dashboard, you can see kind of those metrics across all of us and how we kind of compare to each other. And I think the point that you and I have both been making is that we are our three operators in our region and SEPTA are operating pretty efficient systems and doing as much as we can with sort of as little as we can. Sometimes that's frustrating but that's largely driven by the fact that the systems are chronically underfunded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is, how has paratransit been impacted by the issues at SEPTA?
So paratransit costs continue to go up, and paratransit is something that we contract with providers. Most of our, so the contractor provides the operators, not necessarily the vehicles. So costs have gone up as labor costs have across the system. And we have actually recently replaced our dispatch system. So we used to use Route Match, and now we're using, oh my gosh, it escapes me, but we're using another system that's very good at matching rides. So we've become more efficient in how we dispatch and how we fulfill those trips. However, unfortunately, with the shortage of operators on our contractor side, we're just not fulfilling all the trips. So we're missing a lot of trips that we could fill. And so it's a very strange situation right now where the costs have increased, but we aren't filling all of our trips. So our actual costs are lower. Had we been able to fill everything, or our contractor be able to fill everything, we would have incurred a much higher cost. So yes, paratransit's a big issue, and it has increased in cost, but right now we're sort of flat.
And a sort of related question, is SEPTA looking at cost-effective ideas such as contracting with Uber and Lyft for paratransit?
Yes, we have some thoughts on that, and we've been trying to work with Uber and Lyft on that concept. I'm not aware of anything being actually signed off on or approved of yet, but there is a lot of, like I said, we're missing trips, so it would be helpful to have additional support.
We have a question about capital. With the current administration pulling back funding, how does that impact capital plans at SEPTA and in the RTA region? Any loss of grants experienced by RTA or SEPTA?
Jen, you want to go first and I can jump in?
Yeah, well, we're doing everything we can not to give back any money, or if that's what's meant by that question, the competitive grants like that, the money that we spend to match them, we don't think that we'll have to do that. We didn't do that in the first round of the fiscal 26 budget, the capital program. We deferred those 44 projects, but it did not mean we gave back money. And that is the hope for the next round of cuts as well.
Yeah. And I'll just say and even from a national perspective, while there's been sort of headlines and rhetoric about the federal government pulling back money, I think there might only be actual real examples of one or two in the country, and they're actually smaller funds. And actually, the federal government has actually been issuing funding even on new grants and even on things like purchase of electric vehicles and things like that. So the headlines or sometimes some of the rhetoric isn't necessarily matching the action. I will say though, so we've experienced no loss, and we've made sure though that all as much money is sort of locked down, if you will, and sort of in grants and assigned to projects, so we can kind of continue to use all the monies, the federal monies that have already been sort of allocated. I will say that there has been sort of some slowdown in terms of the federal government issuing sort of further notices of funding options or funding availability for different or expanded or new programs. But we have not seen actual money being pulled back yet. And I guess our hope is that that is not the case based on sort of early indications of how they've even proceeded with some of the new grants across, not just in our region, but across the country as well.
Thank you. Someone says, I know I've heard about plans to shift Metra funds to CTA to delay the financial cliff, which from as I understand it, would set back beyond next year's legislative session. How far would it be estimated that would set back the CTA's financial cliff, and would that potentially put the Metra at greater risk of the financial cliff before any agreement is reached?
So, a lot there, and I won't get into too much detail. It's all available on our website. We've, I think, even put a blog out there explaining sort of the board action that we took. So we're just kind of focusing on 2026 budget funding allocations, and that's the budget cycle that we're in the middle of right now. All three operators are actually getting more money on an annual basis than they had in the previous for 25, for example. So that's sort of one, I think, important note to make. And that's largely being driven by the fact that sales tax in our region is continuing to come in very strong, and that some legislative changes that the General Assembly made more than a year ago, those capturing more online sales, those revenues are sort of helping bolster the system, which is why we've been able to sort of stave off the fiscal cliff as long as we can. Now, when you looked at 26, because the three operators are very different types of operations, and we're not, as Jody sort of talked about, able to sort of just kind of put everybody in one bucket and mix it up as easily. I know that's a very simplification of the whole process, but and much of our funding as it is dictated by state statute as to where it goes to each of the three operators. So the region as a whole doesn't have a lot of discretion in that space. So what you might be referring to in that, and sorry, I said I was going to try to be high level and brief, but I'm not, is we actually, the board, our RTA board took action to hold back some monies that are essentially within that level of discretion. So what we call Innovation Coordination Enhancement Fund, a small amount of money, and some of that being pulled back from PACE and on that hadn't been spent. So PACE and METRA to allocate towards CTA so we can push them basically to the middle of next year. And I think if you've followed the conversation closely, PACE does not have, sorry, and just to clarify, the 2025 allocation was for ADA, paratransit services, for the PACE provides for the entire region. In 2026, the outlook for the budget work that we're doing right now is looking to basically get sort of hold off and stave off service cuts and fare increases, kind of, or service cuts specifically, as long as we can, and really get CTA to the middle of next year. And the logic of that, again, none of these are choices that anybody wanted to ever have to make, is that gives the legislature time to act. And essentially, those monies are discretionary dollars that the RTA has access to. Some of it's coming out of the RTA's actual budget to sort of make some of those programmatic adjustments across the region. And I think Tina just popped in the chat more detail on that, which would probably be easier to follow than my explanation right there.
Thank you. Transport for New South Wales in Australia has used strategies like integrated governance, fare integration through Opal, and diversified revenue streams, for example, tolling and value capture, to stabilize funding. What lessons could CTA, PACE, and METRA, and I'll throw SEPTA in here, take from that model to avoid facing a fiscal cliff in Chicago and in Philadelphia?
So a couple of things. I feel like, contrary to my accent, I'm not necessarily a full expert on the New South Wales transport. I've been my whole professional career has essentially been in the Midwest, but I do have some knowledge of their system. So I will just caveat some of it by it's a very much top-down level of governance and structure, and government role and responsibility at the state level on down. And to the point of even define, like local municipalities don't have the land use jurisdiction that like Illinois does right now. So there's a lot of nuances in, both state and federal law that are very different that don't necessarily apply here. But I will say, I do think that there is some interesting options, and I have spent some time talking with friends and colleagues in Australia about what they've done. An example of sort of the value capture model and thinking about how do we better integrate, land use and transportation together, not telling one or the other what to do, but thinking of ourselves as kind of a sort of a means to an end. And I think Australia's done a really good job of sort of better integrating and capturing value out of the investment of transit and becoming essentially sort of not to the extent of some of our Asian counterparts, and maybe not even to the extent of more modeled on sort of the London model, where thinking about how do we make places, and the transportation is sort of an integral part of that, and making those investments and then capturing some of that value by developing land, air rights, land development opportunities, value capture, some of those things into as a transit entity. And that's actually one of the sort of reform ideas that RTA has sort of put forward to how can we be more strongly authorized as a regional entity to kind of play in that space, generate some of those revenues. And it's not just about even the revenue generation, it's about sort of this holistic look at sort of that integration between land use and transportation and how it all supports each other. That's something that is a sort of a long-term goal. If anyone knows any of my background, I actually am not a transit person. I come to this from a land use background, and so the sort of this nexus between land use and transportation is kind of like that's my jam. And so if you can't tell, I kind of get a little jazzed up about that. And so I think it is some opportunity areas as an example where we could be more creative and push the envelope within the context of recognizing, local municipalities ultimately having land use control and things like that. The RTA has long done a lot of work in around transit-oriented development, and now taking a stronger equity or an equitable focus to that across our region, and sort of capturing some of that role, that value, that investment, and leveraging it and trying to capture some of that value back and sort of using it to further invest into the infrastructure in the system and its operations.
And I mean, I would just add that we looked at a number of places, did peer reviews, and one that stuck out to me, at least for operating funds, was Boston, the MBTA. They have a statewide property assessment on properties that are located near transit or have a transit service with them, and that assessment is a good portion of their operating funding. So I think that's a really interesting one to look at. And I will say, like for Pennsylvania and for the Southeast, we have our counties provide 15% of our operating budget or match 15% of our state funds. And the only real tool that our counties have to raise that money is their property taxing ability. So a good portion of our operating funds do come from that kind of property basis or nexus of funding. However, I do think there's a lot of work that could be done, at least in Pennsylvania, on figuring out how to capture value around the stations. We've done tons of projects or economic impact reports about how much value transit adds to properties around it. So we can very easily quantify that sort of amenity value of transit. And then seeing all the development go on around our transit stations, accessing some of that value would be helpful. We do get sort of tripped up around, the school districts are funded largely through property tax in Pennsylvania. And I think I was reading about Chicago that you had a TIF district where you have a value capture set up, and it doesn't impact the schools as much. So there's more we could be doing in Pennsylvania, certainly in that regard. And like you said, Leanne, like municipalities control development, and that's not something our agency does, but the state could take a heavier hand in how that development occurs.
Or
And
even
then,
just thinking about it in terms of a partnership relationship. And I think one of the things, even transit agencies own a lot of property, how do we become joint developers with the private sector? Let them do what they do, but we get to capture and gain some of that benefit that's derived from that implementation. And Jody, you're exactly right. I mean, our region is already established, like within the city of Chicago, for the Red Line extension and the Red Purple modernization, which is the same line sort of heading north, redevelopment on that. They created a TIF district that carved out the school district, for example, in terms of not having an impact. But that's those revenues, those that value is being used as real money to actually provide the local match to the federal investment. And so, I think we can continue to do more of this. I think that there's opportunities in sort of really thinking, I think being a little more aggressive, but being more creative about how do we partner with, communities and think about sort of joint development opportunities.
yeah, we had one recently. We just put out, well, actually two of our parking lots we've put out for joint development. So structured commuter parking, but then also a multifamily, presumably, or mixed use development, which will help us in terms of ground lease revenues. Will come to SEPTA for that, but on a one-off basis, it's not exactly enough to fill that operating budget gap. I think that the other thing that was mentioned was the fare integration. And I think, over the last few years, SEPTA's done a lot more. We have passes that apply to all modes, because we're one SEPTA. But we've done a lot to bring some of the closer in stations into Zone 1 and then allow all transit users to utilize their pass on those stations. So trying to get more riders through our pass integration or a pass, just expanding the value of the pass. We did just do a fare increase, so that will generate revenue straight off the bat. So
I think we are right at time. Jessica, you want us to wrap up?
Yes, you got through all the questions, I believe.
Oh, good, good. What we efficient,
oh,
Jody.
wow. That's
Um,
great.
I just want to say thank you to Jody for her generous time and being very sort of thoughtful and sharing, being very candid with us about sort of what they've been through. I think it's very helpful information and lessons for us to learn from. And I want to thank all of you for joining this conversation. And like we noted, that we will post all this information and a recording of this for everybody's use. So with that, I will say thank you. And hopefully we'll stay engaged and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.